Welcome back, everybody, to Left Reckoning. You know, a lot of the conversations that we've been having over these past couple of weeks and we'll be having in the future are about, corporations like Amazon, which, as we've seen in Bessemer, are a very mighty foe to come up against and, have a bad history of tough working conditions and a very, very, very calculated strategy for union busting. I wanted to have this conversation today with Charmaine Chua, who is a professor of global studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and is also a member of the Amazonians United Solidarity Committee, and with Ted, who is an Amazon worker in Chicago, who is also an organizer with the Amazonians Chicagoland, about different ways that we can strategize about a corporation like Amazon, and also how that might bleed into other areas of global capitalism, as we are seeing more and more and more. The struggles that we might have on the workplace floor are shared by people all across the globe. And then if we want to build successful movements to challenge those systems, we're going to have to think globally about this. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for inviting me also.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation. Well, I really want to, throw to you first, Charmaine. If you could sort of talk a little bit about your piece that you put in Jacobin, called "Organizing Against Amazon Requires Strategizing Across Global Supply Chains." Could you sort of talk a little bit about the development of this, global supply chain system that we're seeing, and how we need to incorporate that in our different types of organizing in our local communities?
Yeah, sure. So I think in the wake of Bessemer, a lot of what people have been reflecting on is, not only the dismal state of labor law, not only sort of internal organizing on the factory floor, but what it actually requires for us to think about taking on a behemoth like Amazon. I think Amazon is, like the Ford of the past, at the forefront of what changing industry looks like in the United States. And part of taking stock of what Amazon is requires actually reassessing what we used to have as, old school labor organizing policies on the shop, strategies on the shop floor that were premised on this idea, right? That like the auto industry, which had huge centralized kind of automated manufacturing and assembly within the US, and therefore a single factory had huge power. Amazon works really differently. It's not a manufacturing company, right? It's a retailer. And it's a retailer whose whole premise is about, delivering the last mile of delivery at the quickest time possible. So what that means is that Amazon's strategy matters less if you are targeting a single warehouse, given that Amazon has a tracking and tracing and supply chain management technological, architecture that is really focused on figuring out how to get things to the fastest route possible, building in redundancies, thinking about ways to reroute around stoppages. And if you think through the implications of that, it means that even if Bessemer organized, successfully unionized as a single warehouse, what that means for the network is much less clear. And so I think part of what I was, thinking through in the Jacobin piece, but also really learns from the way that Amazonians United has thought about its strategy, is the necessity of thinking geographically about what it means to organize as regions, where rather than assuming that, Amazon can reroute around one warehouse, what does it look like to recognize that as a strategy and build forms of organizing around which Amazon cannot reroute? And I'll quickly say historically that there is a larger case for this in the kind of changing patterns of the global political economy. Between the 1960s to present, there has been a huge shift in the way that capital accumulation has thought about itself. Where the invention of the shipping container made shipping goods across the ocean so cheap, right? That it's now, I often give this example, it's cheaper to send a fish that's been caught in Alaska to China to be filleted and then ship back again to American markets than it is to pay for labor to fillet it here. And what that means, of course, right, is that the shipping network has become so immensely mobile that manufacturing jobs that have left the US have been moved to other countries. And so I think there's a conversation here that we can also have about what it means to think strategically across not just the North American supply chain, but the global supply chain and the way that it relies on this kind of vast and intensely spread out hierarchical network of production, distribution, and circulation.
And, you know, in the case of, in the piece, you also talk about how in Europe, this kind of strategizing has been really important, particularly with in Germany when they were trying to sort of come after, you know, Amazon. Basically, they needed to make sure that they were also building solidarity with Polish workers too, instead of just German workers.
Yeah, Spiff, do you want to talk about this because you're part of that network? Sorry, Ted.
Sure. Yeah, my understanding is Amazon Workers International are some of our counterparts in Europe, and they're organized in multiple countries. And they're much further along in their organization. I think many of them are in formal legal unions recognized by the German and Polish states and so on, Spain as well. And when they were highly organized in, I think, a number of German cities, and in applying pressure on Amazon to negotiate when they sought to go on strike and make demands. Amazon simply rerouted their packages through Poland, where my understanding is the pay is something like a third of the pay in Germany. And their network was simply, it was redundant enough that they could even reroute basically around an entire region of Germany through Poland to circumvent and break the strike. So yeah, that's my understanding of how the network has been flexibly used by Amazon to just work around workers getting organized.
Is there anything else about just-in-time or flexible production as a worker that, what does that mean to you? Like those concepts?
Yeah, I mean, what it means to us as workers is more so for those of us that work full-time in an Amazon warehouse, you know, the day in, day out for us of work is, you know, we see right now in Megacycle, which we work 1:20 a.m. to 11:50 a.m. So we see the backs of our eyelids while we're sleeping. We see the very little sunlight because that's the rest of the time that we're sleeping. And then we see the inside of the warehouse. So I think the global dynamic of the logistics network is not obvious or not visible to the vast majority of workers from our direct experience. And that the logistics flexibility that we experience is more along the lines of how Amazon is what I say, like gigifying, like what Uber is for rideshare, for cab rides. Amazon is gigifying logistics. They're turning warehouse work into basically a gig job where there's high turnover. The shifts are brutal, but they frequently, just based on how they schedule workers for each shift at each warehouse, they frequently, they call it an offer, and you know, it's an opportunity to take a furlough day. They call it VTOs, or voluntary time off, as well as they frequently send out voluntary extra time or sometimes mandatory extra time. So they basically have shifts that workers can, you know, on their phone, just like you can accept you know, a ride share or put a call from an app, you can freely pick up new shifts or give up your hours. And what that means for us is on any given night, we don't know how many other coworkers we're going to have for any given night or how much volume there will be. However Amazon is choosing to run it, each night could have a different volume. We could have a different number of coworkers, and it's frequently due to obvious profit, greed, and so on. We're always understaffed because every night we show up and it turns out, well, 20% of our coworkers were given a voluntary time off, so they didn't even come into work, and now they're rushing the rest of us to work faster, and so to move the same amount of volume. And so that's the sort of flexibility that I think we see from the shop floor. The larger kind of regional and global, it's less obvious to us as workers, but it's part of the same, my understanding is it's part of the same strategy of maximizing the efficiency through flexibility that can maximize and just profit based on changing market and changing volume of packages and orders day by day.
And I want to come back in a little bit, Ted, to talk about this like turnover and gigification stuff, because that's really interesting for organizing. But I just wanted to ask Charmaine here about this scale, because it's like obviously Amazon is doing this, but this seems to be the trend across the board for companies to rely on these quickly moving distribution networks. We saw that obviously really exposed to a lot of folks when COVID first hit. And people started to realize that there's a lot of people and a lot of moving pieces that go into providing all the goods and services that you rely on every day. But this is the general trend that we've been seeing for the past few decades towards this kind of distribution network or logistics network.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think we're still figuring out just how much things are changing. I think the thing that is clear is that, when Amazon started Amazon Prime, which was in 2010, it's not that long ago. And yet many of us have no memory of what the world was like before we could click on a thing and have it arrive at our doorstep in 2 days, right? But it's a really recent development. And when Amazon proposed Prime delivery, it was a radically ridiculous thing that even they weren't sure shareholders would buy, right? The idea that you could charge $99 so that delivery itself became a commodity that you were selling felt unimaginable. And the way in which Amazon has succeeded at doing this, I think its corporate strategy is really, important to think about, is that Amazon has used its profits in Amazon Web Services to largely subsidize the high costs that it takes to build out such a large network of factories, right? Like when we click on that button, we assume it as a kind of invisible thing, but as Ted's testimony shows, what it relies on is this massive scale of a rollout of buying up more and more warehouses across the country. And I think one thing that has been really clear, and I think is a pattern that kind of relies on the history of deindustrialization, is that as deindustrialization brought jobs out of the US and into countries where they could rely on histories of colonialism to produce cheaper wages, a lot of municipal officials from California all the way to New York City, right, saw logistics as a viable growth strategy that they could then invite back into decaying neighborhoods. And they literally, if you talk to and look at historical documents, California officials, for example, saw it as a kind of new opening of a gateway to the new age of globalization. And I think what that means when we think about the scale at which Amazon now works and all of the companies that have now followed suit is that it has captured so much of the market share and pushed down the price of delivery so far that it can essentially use, I think, that the ways in which workers have now been kind of left out of more stable manufacturing jobs to its benefit. So when Amazon makes decisions around where to site warehouses and where to build them, they actually look at the median income in those neighborhoods. They certainly look at the property values of that neighborhood, right? And so what that means is they're building in the suburbs of Chicago, they're building in the suburbs of Minneapolis, they're building in the suburbs of California, all of which are increasingly places where more Black and brown, more lower wage, more working class folks who've been pushed out of cities because of rising real estate prices have gone. Right. And that means that you have, I think, in a lot of Amazon facilities and in a lot of delivery facilities, just-in-time flexibilized workers who are, already historically disenfranchised and lower wage. but also who often have to take up 2 to 3 jobs just to be able to pay for food and to be able to live for their families. And that's, I think, something that is really important to think about in terms of labor organizing and movement strategy, right? What does it mean to take seriously the fact that we're working within a kind of forefront of a changing industry that is also where the largest proportion of Black and brown workers are cited today?
And like on that question, Ted, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on this, specifically because, as you were saying, like, workers are finding their jobs becoming more and more gigified. From my understanding, in a lot of the postmortems we've seen from Bessemer, one of the factors that some people have noted has been like the high turnover rate, where a lot of people who are very frustrated with their job, well, they just end up leaving. And, so that certainly makes it very difficult to organize, not just because, people are leaving, but also this kind of shared understanding and camaraderie. If you're having people sort of coming in and out of the, the facility or the workplace, trying to build that, oh, you are, a fellow worker with me, like we have something in common and we need to stand up together. How can you how are you sort of strategizing about bridging that gap and sort of, putting that pitch to folks?
Yeah, so we definitely see the effect where, for example, when Amazon closed the warehouse I was working in for almost 2 years, DCH1, and then they forced us all to transfer to one of 3 new facilities in the Chicago area. The location transfer also came with the schedule change. So we went from an overnight, which was already 8:15 p.m. to 4:45 a.m., to mega cycle, which is 1:20 a.m. to 11:50 a.m. And obviously this change was a mass firing event. Like anyone with children, they need to get ready at 8:25 a.m. Anyone with elderly, they need to take care of. Anyone with other jobs or anything else going on in the morning, they were basically, well, if you can't accept this new shift, then you're terminated. And just like Charmaine said, based on how Amazon is situating themselves, they're looking for the most desperate, the most malleable, the most controllable workers that can come into these warehouses and put up with a 10-hour overnight, brutal, on your feet warehouse job. And they're definitely, we see this day to day in the warehouse, night to night in the warehouse, where it's more and more the workers that our coworkers are the people that simply, they need this job, they need this income. This is what's available because Amazon is more and more putting other companies out of business and kind of, and so there's definitely that effect. And how we've responded as Amazonians United Chicagoland, how we've continued to organize, we recognize that with high turnover, that means that we can't simply follow, I think, traditional models of organizing where whether it's focused on a card signing campaign where you hope that, in a certain period of time, you have enough people signed on that they'll still be around to make the vote and then still be around to negotiate and then still be around, I think a more paper-based organizing strategy is what gets kind of preempted by the high turnover. And what's more important to organize is your workplace culture, your workplace community, where you can, from the first day, from the first week, a new worker comes in, if you've grown and built a culture where you don't put up with bullshit and disrespect from management, where you know exactly when and how long your breaks are, and you always take them, every single second of them, where anytime something happens, people stand up. A new coworker coming into the space where we are organized enough and have built a culture that we respond to the abuses and disrespect, well, they quickly get drawn in and can be part of this community. And some of the things that we did that was made more difficult by COVID and social distancing, but that we continue to maintain, is strong workplace community where, whether it's a potluck table at lunch, whether it's just having a strong friendships with our coworkers that are dealing with the same, bullshit that we are. These are spaces where within a matter of days, new coworkers can coworkers are frequently leaving for a whole variety of reasons. Their bodies are breaking down. They're finding other jobs that are better hours, whatever, family needs, whatever it might be. But new coworkers that are coming in can be quickly brought into community space together, and we can build relationships and kind of maintain our strength and connection as coworkers. And so I think high turnover, responding to high turnover means we need more community-based organizing, more culture-based organizing, to really transform how we relate to each other as coworkers, how we think of ourselves in our own minds, how we treat each other, as opposed to something more superficial, even paper membership in a business union, for example, that sort of thing. That I think those ties are less strong.
Yeah, no, I mean, not to belabor everyone with this story again, but like in my experience, one of my first jobs was laying concrete. And, I was just like a young kid showing up, didn't know anybody else. And my boss almost immediately was trying to take advantage of me by making me pay for my own equipment. And everyone else on the floor, all the other coworkers, he drove me to Walmart, maybe buy concrete boots, right? And he said, I'll take that out of your paycheck at the end of the week. And I'm like, okay, I didn't know any better. And then I came back and everybody, came up to me and said, did he pay for those and I said, yeah, but he said he's going to take them out of my paycheck. He said, well, that ain't right. And they all stood up to him, this is like 6-7 people, but they all stood up to him. And, this was in South Carolina, so it wasn't unionized work or anything like that. But it was, at least for me, it was quite a baptizing moment in thinking about labor politics. Is that, okay, well, these guys are my friends and my teammates and my comrades, much more than any boss or anything like that. So I think that's exactly, the way that we have to be thinking about it and being flexible. Do you mind? I know this is a big question, Ted, but how can we then expand that though, if we're saying that we have to be sort of global and regional in our perspectives? How can we build those ties that actually are going past just our face-to-face coworkers?
So I'm not gonna pretend to have the answer to that question, and I'm gonna side-eye anyone that claims to be an expert on this is how it's gonna be, because I know they're just making shit up. I don't think any of us knows really. I think the strategy that I see potentially emerging is one where, well, for example, a lot of things that I read about, the history of labor and different struggles in different times. Take, for example, that, social media didn't exist for anything before 2000. I think a lot of the ways that we interact now as coworkers, I'm connected with many of my coworkers over Facebook, and we're interacting, outside of work, sometimes during break at work. And so I think there are different ways that we stay connected as coworkers, locally as well as globally. Some of the Amazon Workers International folks, we've been in communication with over email and social media, and are able to connect and kind of share with each other knowledge and strategies for what's working, what's not. So I think leveraging the tools that are available that our elders and ancestors did not have available, in new and creative ways, I think are important. I think also recognizing that when we're building and organizing, I think it's important to think as growing the culture and the movement of workers that respect ourselves and respect each other and know what we need to be doing to stand up, and what strategies do we need to be taking, what strategies are effective at getting an immediate issue resolved from our local management, or getting larger issues addressed by Amazon as a whole. I think how we communicate and share these things, we've been trying to do more and more as Amazonians United Chicagoland, being on Twitter, being on Instagram, sharing, whenever we do things, I think whenever we take action, I think it's important to be documenting. And, I have some great photographer friends that are always like, yeah, let me come through and we'll, here's a good shot. If we show this, then that image will if you get a well-placed, social media, but a well-placed, even mainstream media piece, suddenly, we were getting calls from workers in Florida and in Maryland and in other states. I'm like, hey, we saw what you're doing. Like, we're trying to start our first petition. Like, how can we learn from you? And so I think it's just sort of being humble about not having the answers, being as smart as we can about the tools and technology that's available, and thinking regionally, but also dreaming globally in terms of whenever we act, whenever we organize, whenever we take action, know that we should also be kind of documenting and sharing, visually, emotionally, mentally, what we're doing with our coworkers in other parts of the world in a way that we can inspire and be inspired by each other's activities. I think that's also an important element to keep the connection and kind of build the culture and build the movement, not just one organization and one facility or one isolated group of people.
Can I come in here and say something? I think that what Ted has laid out is very different from organizations that are only based on social media campaigns, right? Like what Ted is talking about is building strong organizing communities on the ground that then share the success of their petition or their, solidarity work that then brings other workers into the conversation. I think I have seen in the Amazon circuit a lot of groups that are sort of like primarily focused on the social media campaign, right? So promoting like boycott consumer campaigns that have very little grounding on and relationship to workers. Or in the Bessemer campaign, a lot of time, I think importantly so, was spent kind of building solidarity from the community, right? Like building webinars and things like that. And I have a friend in Minneapolis who often says this to me, right? Always look to the class and not to the left. And I think in this case, like, parts of the Bessemer campaign look to the left and not to the class, right? It was focused on kind of shifting the imagination of what was possible around the Bessemer Drive that I think to some extent was about generating momentum towards passing the PRO Act rather than being really grounded on and focused on what it looks like to organize workers. And I don't have boots on the ground to know what was done as a kind of strategy at the shop floor level. So I won't say, I'm sure that, RWDSU did do that work, right? But I think there are ways that I think we importantly have to think about what it means to ground ourselves in workers first and not the left first. Not that those two categories don't intersect.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. I really appreciate you saying that, because I realized thinking back to what I just said, I was like, oh yeah, I took for granted, like my baseline assumption is if you don't have workers that organize, there's nothing to share on social media or anything else. Like, what are you sharing? Some fake, crafted, manufactured images or something. And so, yeah, definitely, like you have to have real worker organization, real worker relationships, real worker power. That means, strong relationships in community with your coworkers where an issue comes up. Hey, should we do a petition for this? Yeah, I guess. Okay. I guess we got 100 signatures. Okay. Do we turn it in? Oh, we got this issue addressed. Great. Like that, the assumption, like that should be the existing engine that is the basis of your power of addressing the issues. And then everything else that I said is, oh yeah, sharing and building movement and so on. I think that's important. That's the part where we're trying to make sure we do more of so that we can be more connected with more folks. But none of that matters if you don't have real worker organization.
Yeah. And I think we saw that lesson sort of in real time in Bessemer, where there was like an online campaign that I can't remember who was sort of pushing it to push for this nationwide boycott of Amazon. And then organizers in Bessemer and people there were saying like, well, this isn't coming from us. It's like, obviously Amazon's a bad corporation, all that kind of stuff. But this is a demand and a campaign that people are saying they're doing in the name of somebody without ever consulting folks, in the first place. Right. And I think some people, especially people who are newer to the left and thinking about labor politics, that's something that you have to start building those organic connections. I think it's hard just talking, for somebody who does, left media. A lot of folks, they see these as like, almost spectacle, like they're things to watch instead of like actually organic, movements. And I think it's really important to start, being organized in your community, getting to know people in a very specific way rather than just, watching. But before we moved on, I want to see if Charmaine had anything to add about just sort of organizing in the, in the broader community and how we can think about that in relation to these labor struggles.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think to add to Smith, I don't think anybody has clear answers here, but one thing that I think Amazonians United has been highlighting and that I've been really interested in thinking about is the extent to which taking really seriously the fact that many workers in Amazon warehouses are immigrants, right? Is that I think there has been this kind of ongoing assumption that the primary way that we relate to each other and change our material experiences is primarily through our identification as workers. And I think that that's right to a lot of extents, right? Worker organizing involves bringing people into conversation on class-based and work-based issues that challenge you on the shop floor. But I think there's also lots of interesting ways in which people are starting to think about what it looks like to develop and concentrate on the fact that you are organizing within and between immigrant networks, right? So the Atwood Center outside of Minneapolis in Shakopee, for example, primarily it's Somali immigrant refugee workers. So I think they do and spend a lot of time on thinking about what it would look like to organize while focused on immigrant identities in addition to work-based identities. I think the other, interesting example to think through is that the ConAgra plant, which was unionized by UFCW in the early 2000s, one of the kind of strategies that they used was that a lot of the immigrant meat packers in Omaha, Nebraska were Christians, right? So they gathered in a church, and it was Guatemalans, Salvadorans, Mexican beef plant packing house workers who came together under the community that Christianity or religion was bringing them together with. So one, I think, interesting thing that AU has been doing, for example, is bringing in things like community blockades and campaigns, right? Asking solidarity committees to organize around things like climate change that broader community organizations are thinking about in relationship to labor, but not exclusively focused on labor. And I think that there is some exploration that we have yet to fully think through there about linking workers' movements to community organizing more broadly.
I think that's very on, and also like it's no accident that we're seeing these the success of like these gigafied movements, from corporations like Uber and Amazon, and this sort of difficulty when it comes to organizing, when people consider themselves as members of a class, just because this also coinciding with the time where more and more of those social spaces have been destroyed by neoliberalism, right? So like where those community spaces actually are existing and are really strong, leaning on those and building those out is really important, because I don't know, neoliberalism has very much like decimated, a lot of people's sense of community, and leaning into that and rebuilding it, understanding that as something that's radical and has a lot of organizing potential. It's also just an important thing as a human being to be a member of a community too. Not to sound like, anyway, it's something worthwhile.